Dr. Leo Trasande, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
Oh, it's great to be here and be back and in person.
In person this time.
Oh, yeah.
You were one of our OG guests. Yeah, back episode 100 and something.
Yeah, 119.
Way back when.
Wild.
Well, the topic of your expertise has only gained further momentum since your last appearance on the show, and for good reason. It's an important one.
Yeah.
So, and I know that you are playing a major role now in not just pushing the research forward, but also advocating for greater awareness around the potential harms of environmental toxins.
Yeah.
So thank you.
No, I'm happy to help and appreciate your leadership too in so many ways. You've lent a really strong voice that is needed. In my own profession, we only got 1 to 3 hours of environmental health and medical school training. And that's one of the areas that we keep fighting to try to elevate the presence. And that's probably where it all begins in terms of our, failure to really address this in a positive way. I'm not trying to throw my profession under the proverbial bus, but, if you don't know about it, when a patient comes in and say, I've had these symptoms and they may be environmental exposures of concern, or my water's contaminated with nonstick chemicals, these PFAS, these forever chemicals that affect 100 million Americans now to this day, the answer is going to usually be, well, you're okay, because the three most fearsome words for a healthcare provider to often say is, I don't know. That's a little bit of an uncomfortable conversation. We're not really trained to have those kinds of conversations. And as we've gotten curious about the effects of these contaminants and we search more and look deeper, we unfortunately find more. I'm not going to tell you that the evidence is lock, stock, barrel perfect the way you would like to see, but the more we look, the more we have to worry.
Yeah, the more you look, the more you find.
Yep.
Typically. And yeah, so I'd love to just, dive straight in, because you just came out with a study that has made waves, garnered headlines, and for good reason, connecting exposure to phthalates, which is a certain plasticizing chemical. It's a word that might not be all too unfamiliar to my audience, but maybe we can start there. What are phthalates, and what is the potential risk that they're posing to our health?
So phthalates are added to soften plastics. They're also used in some cases as part of fragrances in the mix to make something have the right scent and have that scent stay around. But in these plastics, non-stick, not non-stick anymore. We're not talking about PFAS. We're talking about a different category of chemicals. But polyvinyl chloride plastics are characteristically hard and brittle. In fact, some of the pipes that are being used to replace the lead pipes in Flint, Michigan, because of lead, are polyvinyl chloride, and they don't need as much phthalates to soften them up. But when you add phthalates to polyvinyl chloride, you soften it up and you make it into very flexible material that can be used in shrink wrap, in food packaging, in a host of things. And in our modern lifestyle, we became inured to using it in all sorts of ways, and we didn't realize the consequences that we face today. And it may be that phthalates are also only part of the story, because when you're talking about plastics in general, we're talking not just about the chemicals that are added to plastics. We're not talking about the breakdown products of plastics. I mean, plastics at a basic level, just to take a step back, are these polymers, these boring molecules. You just literally chain together things through chemistry, billions of the same thing over and over again. DNA is frightfully more complicated with 4 base pairs, A, C, G, T. Plastics are just the same bisphenol or phthalate, or not phthalate, to be clear. Phthalates are additives to polyvinyl chloride. Vinyl chloride comes from ethylene, and if you bring it all the way back, what we're talking about when we're talking about plastics are the byproducts of fossil fuel production. Because if you use oil or gas, you make either a propane or ethane. You crack that into propylene or ethylene. Propylene gives you polypropylene plastic, and ethylene gives you polyethylene plastic. And you further crack it down, and you've got vinyl chloride. And that vinyl chloride makes polyvinyl chloride, to which phthalates are added to soften it and are used in so many products in our daily lives.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're byproducts of fossil fuels, and we use them to create plastics. And plastics are not plastics. I mean, when did plastics first come on the scene and begin this sort of steady, insidious saturation of modern life?
World War II was the moment that we realized the utility of these polymers for a host of different technologies. And that's only exploded over time. There have only been 3 pauses in the exponential growth of plastic production to date. The 1970s oil crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. We just have this exponential rise in plastic production and consumption globally because we've become inured to this modern lifestyle, assuming that we should be using these materials and substituting out the older school materials, glass, stainless steel, and what have you. And it's now moving to these industrialized countries where plastic production is going to be chiefly done as of 2030. So according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the majority of plastic production and consumption will be there. It won't be in the US, Canada, Europe, what have you. It'll be over there. And the science has only barely caught up. First, it was because of the understanding that chemicals added to plastic materials were hacking our hormones, our natural signaling molecules, which we'll get into in a second. But now we appreciate there might even be another dimension to the mix. It might be micro nanoplastics, literally breakdown products of plastic materials that are hacking, that are literally wrecking balls in our tissues. And on the latter front, we still have a lot more work to do. That's very, very new science. And when it comes to chemicals used in plastic materials, that science is very new too, but we now have substantial evidence to act. And that's because these chemicals used in plastic materials hack, again, our hormones, which are so crucial to every biological function known to humankind: temperature, metabolism, salt, sugar, and even sex.
Wow. And that's why they're known as endocrine disruptors, right?
Exactly. Endocrine is for hormone.
And at what point did phthalates, so plastics just after World War II became ubiquitous.
Right.
But then phthalates were added later as a way to soften these compounds?
So phthalates were added a little bit later onto the scene when we realized that polyvinyl chloride could be used in food packaging. And so as we got really used to crinkly food wrap, saran wrap was the first wave of that use. We started to add phthalates into a host of different products. Now it's in personal care products and cosmetics as well.
Wow.
And the more we think about plastic, we have to appreciate that some of the things we don't think are plastic are actually plastic linings. So nail polish, paint are other examples of plastic in our lives.
Man, and well, I guess before we get to the health risks, I mean, I guess it's worth also noting that plastic has, I mean, it's revolutionized society in so many ways. Many of those ways are positive, right? Like we wouldn't have modern medicine without plastic, correct?
Absolutely. So I take an antacid pill every day, and it's ironically a sustained release capsule that's composed of plastic. And that's where there's this very uncomfortable convergence. Now, it's a different story when I'm talking about that kind of plastic in that it's for direct human benefit. You know, I take that and the nanoplastic molecules are, that are being delivered there. I mean, the nanoplastic is the way that the drug for treatment is being delivered to ultimately the lining of my intestines. And it's trying to calm my, keep my caffeine habit going at the same time.
Is that common that plastic is used in extended release capsules, encapsulation technology?
It is, and I'm not trying to impugn that use at all. But the reason I bring this up is that when you think about nanoplastics and microplastics that are breaking off from plastics that we use in other products that are not intended for that direct exposure, the consequences are altogether real, not just because these micro nanoplastics are direct wrecking balls to human tissue. They're also delivering toxic chemicals that are along for the ride. The chemicals used in the intentionally added substances and non-intentionally added substances. We now have knowledge that 16,000 chemicals are used in plastic materials. That's from the most recent report. That number keeps increasing. It was 10,000 a few years back. Now it's 13,000. And most recently it's 16,000.
Whoa, that's alarming though. I didn't realize that plastic was being used in like pharmaceuticals that we ingest.
I mean, again, the point here is not to focus, on the essential uses of plastic and eliminate them. We need to minimize the use of plastic in general.
Yeah.
But we have this large amount of low-hanging fruit in the non-essential uses of plastic that we need to reduce because of the human health effects of those exposures.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about that, because most often plastics are talked about, the potential risks of plastic. Usually it's in the context of environmental health. And climate change and all that stuff, but we're now starting to gather data suggesting that these plastics are actually not inert in our bodies. We accumulate them, and they're being linked to all kinds of negative health outcomes. I mean, your most recent paper linked it to cardiovascular death.
Right, and that's because phthalates literally wreck our metabolism. They reprogram in little babies. They may shrink babies' growth such that they are set up for what's called a thrifty phenotype. Their bodies are metabolically reprogrammed to keep calories in and use and store it as fat, protecting against some hypothetical famine or other situation where they don't have the calories around at the same time. And what also happens is that they contribute to obesity in later life because they change how certain genes are expressed that are crucial to lipid and carbohydrate metabolism. So you're imagining you have a good workout, you're thinking, you're having a high protein meal, you think that's going to help your biceps get bigger. The fact is your body gets scrambled in its approach, and it puts those calories in the wrong place.
Damn. That's not good. So what are the main buckets of plastics and related compounds that you think we ought to be mindful of? There's, as you alluded to, we've got microplastics, nanoplastics, and then we've got these plasticizing chemicals. Right, like phthalates and BPA. Did I characterize that landscape
So
properly?
the chemicals of greatest concern in plastic, and again, there's 16,000, about 10,000 have no data whatsoever. I'm only talking about a tip of a very big iceberg. But the chemicals of greatest concern we know the most about are the phthalates, these additives to polyvinyl chloride. Polycarbonate plastics have bisphenols, BPA being the prototype, or bisphenol A. That is also estrogenic, makes fat cells bigger, disrupts disrupts heart function through adiponectin dysfunction. And then we also have the knowledge that there are flame retardants added to plastic. It used to be the brominated variety of flame retardants, the ones that really were problematic for thyroid hormone, which is our master regulator of metabolism and so crucial for babies' brain development. But now we have phosphorus-based flame retardants that have largely replaced the brominateds, and they seem to actually have some of the same and unfortunate similar health effect profiles. And then the nonstick chemicals, or PFAS, that we talked about, that also contribute to obesity as well as other unfortunate consequences, cancer, reproductive consequences.
Wow. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, but let's, I guess, start with phthalates. Where do they typically hang out, and how can we reduce our exposure to them? And is there any known way to purge? I mean, I know that these compounds bioaccumulate, and we all pretty much have them in us these days, but is there anything that we can do, like assuming we've amassed some concentration of them?
So phthalates are added to these polyvinyl chloride plastics used in softer food packaging. The good news about the phthalates is that they have a relatively short half-life in the human body. So studies in high-income as low as low-income populations have documented that you can reduce levels of exposure in 3 days, either through changing your diet or reading the label on cosmetics to identify the chemicals of concern and avoid that. And insofar as you keep making those safe and simple steps to reduce exposure, you can have short, medium, and long-term benefits to reducing exposure. In the short term, you can see the urinary levels of these chemicals drop In the medium term, you see changes in hormone levels. And in the longer term, you see a reduction in chronic disease profile. Because we know phthalates contribute to obesity. They're diabetogenic as well. They contribute to diabetes. And we know they contribute to inflammation in our body, which is crucial and not very good for coronary arteries. Because if you have a little injury to the coronary artery lining, plaque might open up, clots will get in, and that will set the stage for cardiovascular events.
Wow. And what are they doing in our cosmetics? I know that phthalates are also frequently used in fragrances.
Yes.
Like what are they doing in those contexts?
I'm not a fragrance chemist, but the idea is that it sustains the life of the scent. So it makes that scent stay for a longer period of time.
And cosmetics, are they also being used as like a preservative of sorts, do we think?
At some level, we have to go back to cosmetics being, akin to plastics. I'm not literally saying we're painting our bodies, but that there's a material science property to it that allows it to be used more readily for that purpose.
Wow. And by way of food, so obviously, and cosmetics are not, they're non-essential. So, I mean, like, should be fairly easy to identify and reduce your exposure there. But when it comes to the food supply, the foods that we're eating, what would you say are the big levers to pull to reduce our exposure there?
So we're talking about processed foods largely. Unfortunately, ultra-processed food is a great source of phthalate exposure because you can imagine there's a lot of plastic tubing in the machinery. There's a lot of contact points, and that enhances exposure. And so we know that and from national surveys of the U.S. population, that the more ultra-processed food you eat, the higher your phthalates are in your urine. And so insofar as you reduce ultra-processed food consumption and ideally reduce food consumption that has any contact with plastics, such as phthalates in particular, polyvinyl chloride plastics, you can reduce exposure.
Now, I don't know how much you can speak to the pharmacokinetics of these chemicals, but like, say you're buying an unprocessed food, like we'll say a steak, like a piece of meat, right? And it's covered in the supermarket in a soft plastic, which is often the case. Are the phthalates able to migrate into the meat somehow in that context, or we don't quite know?
There's fewer data that I'd like to see, but what we do know is those chemicals do migrate into food. Now, the step I would take if I had that and if I just bought it is to ideally take that off if I can and transfer it to a glass or other container.
And it's also if it's like cold, which it often is, right? Like fresh meat is cold.
Yep.
That probably reduces, right? I would suspect reduces the degree of migration.
Absolutely. And the opposite is the biggest problem of all. If you're microwaving, for example, or machine dishwashing plastics, you are basically inviting the chemicals to leach because phthalates, for example, are not covalently bound to the plastic material in the first place. And so they'll more readily migrate. Not to mention the micro nanoplastics that can break down more readily in the presence of heat. I mean, these polymers are only so strong. With time and with heat, they'll break off into various smaller sizes. That's why we see them in macroplastics over time, in the oceans where plastics break off, and then, ultimately at smaller levels, at a microscopic level, we see them too.
We often think about fragrances as compounds that we're breathing in, maybe putting on ourselves in the case of perfume. But what about fragranced dish soaps? I mean, that to me would be an obvious way in which we're actually ingesting fragrances which are comprised of these compounds.
One of the issues here that I have to acknowledge is fragrance is a proverbial loophole in the federal regulations, at least in the United States. So when something is listed as a fragrance, I can't tell you all the ingredients that are in there. So at some level, we're dealing with a proverbial black box phenomenon. So my suggestion is to try to avoid products that have phthalate or fragrance, to err on the side of caution.
Now, what did you find in this most recent study? You found that hundreds of thousands of deaths were being linked to exposure to these chemicals.
Makes me sound like an alarmist, huh?
I think awareness is not necessarily alarmism. I think that the more awareness, the better.
Right. I agree. And there's now enough data to bring the alarm. We know that these phthalates contribute to obesity and diabetes. We know that polyvinyl chloride micro and nanoplastics were found in the carotid arteries of adults who were getting proverbial clean out. I mean, the carotid arteries are what feed oxygen to your brain, ultimately. And the particles they found there were polyvinyl chloride and polyethylene chloride, and those were associated with a 4-fold, kid you not, risk of the composite outcome of heart attack, stroke, or death. A year before, we had found that urinary levels of phthalates in a national survey, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, were also associated with cardiovascular and all-cause mortality, not cancer mortality. So it was a very specific effect on the cardiovascular system that we were finding. So that really was the evidentiary brick and mortar, if you will, that we're working on. We had already extrapolated that 50,000 Americans between the ages of 55 and 64 died each year due to early heart disease. And those are peak earning years. So if you think about it in terms of a money thing, not that everything is about money at some level, we're talking about $24 billion in lost economic productivity literally shoved off the table. So more recently what we did was to take global data on phthalate exposures. Not every country in the world has had a research study looking at these exposures. So we did our best. At some level, we had to look at continents or subcontinents of exposure. And we modeled the impacts at each part of the globe, and then specifically took data on heart disease deaths and incidents from this Global Burden of Disease project. So these are data that are readily vetted in association with the World Health Organization. And what we found, putting together the exposure data, we calculated a risk of heart attack, and well, not heart attack directly, by the way, cardiovascular mortality, all types of events. And then we added that all up and found that 356,000 people died in 2018 between the ages of 55 and 64. So that's 13% of global cardiovascular mortality in that age group that can be related to phthalate exposure. And about 95% of it at least is directly due to plastic, because most of the phthalates we use are used in plastic materials. What's even more frightening is where the risk was concentrated. So we think of plastic as a high-income phenomenon. You know, bougie, we eat packaged processed food, we have more access to it, and these lower-income countries, they farm, they do other things, and they don't have the same plastic problem. Plastic effects on cardiovascular mortality were actually concentrated in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And that's because we have to think about plastic as a life cycle phenomenon. It's not just where it's consumed, it's where it's produced and where the waste ultimately ends up. We're still talking about 10% of mortality in the US, for example, but in certain 3/4 of the total, mortality was concentrated just in those 3 regions of the world. So that's why this isn't just a U.S. health issue from a policy perspective. This is a global health policy issue.
Now, this was obviously an observational study,
yes,
an alarming one. How confident are you you've already talked about many of the potential mechanisms here, but how confident are you in like a causal pathway?
So I'm never going to say that any one study defines causation, but let's take a step back at what we call causality. So this British scientist, Sir Austin Bradford Hill, defined causality about 60 years. By the way, in the context of the tobacco wars. So this is where a very similar debate was brewing. Do we act about tobacco? Well, we're doing the same thing now when we're talking about plastic. We're debating, do we really need it and what are the consequences? So what he said is there are these 9 criteria you use. You have to have exposure before outcome. So you have to have plastic exposure before mortality, common sense stuff. And then there are all these criteria that you use: consistency of the data, mechanism, various things that give you more confidence.
This is known as the Bradford Hill criteria, right?
Exactly. So those criteria have been manipulated over the years in the way we communicate about them in the general medical audience in particular, because we assume it's either yes or no. But there are shades of gray. That's what this has always been about. He said so, and he made it very clear that you have to take the stakes into account. It's really, do you have enough information to act when it comes to plastic and human health? He talked back then about an occupational carcinogen. So he said, if you have this paint varnish that these workers are using and they're dying, let's say, of liver cancer, okay, maybe I have a little bit of evidence and I'm going to err on the side of caution and act to prevent exposure. Common sense at some level. Whereas if I tell you I'm only going to let you eat green food going forward, and I don't, maybe I do need a lot of evidence to tell you not to eat tomatoes, for example, or bananas. So that, there's just a common sense notion. Unfortunately, over the years, we've maladapted to that. I think it's some of this randomized control trial dogma that's around pharmaceuticals in particular. And, you go to lead exposure, which is an interesting comparison here. Everyone says, oh, there's so much evidence, it's straightforward. That's true, but it's not 100%. When it comes to I don't specifically know all the mechanisms when it comes to lead exposure and effects on kids' brain development, effects on heart disease, by the way, in adults too. But we have enough information to act, and we're in a very similar place when it comes to plastic and human health.
Yeah, it is crazy to me that it seems like such an uphill battle to get to achieve acceptance around the notion that these xenobiotic chemicals might actually be doing harm to us. It's like you see so many people coming out of the woodwork acting as apologists for the chemical industry, when it's like, I mean, look at population health. It's like you'd have to bury your head under the sand to assume that there's not some kind of nefarious exposure happening above and beyond just calorie intake.
Well, we're talking about a $750 billion global industry. So there are money consequences for the people who are making these materials. And look, I'm not trying to take us back to the 1940s. I'm not trying to make us use glass and stainless steel at every conceivable use. And I'm not throwing darts completely at the food industry directly here. I don't think they have necessarily, not everybody has ill intentions, but we do have to acknowledge there's been a lot of misinformation that's been driven by financial incentives. And just to give you context, when you look at that 350 some odd thousand deaths globally, and you put a value on a statistical life, which is a bit of a nerdy term, but it basically is the way economists say, okay, if people are dying, how much do we value that as a society in terms of the trade-offs? And in terms of the year's life lost, there's also a value you can put on that. The ranges we came up with were $500 billion to $3.74 trillion in cost per year. And that's side by side with this $750 billion global industry from its revenue perspective. I'm not saying that we need to close out the plastic industry. Again, there are, as a pediatrician, I acknowledge that I've given albuterol inhalers, nebulizers using plastic equipment. I take my own pharmaceutical for my heartburn, and that has plastic capsules that deliver drugs for human benefit. So there are going to be essential uses, but we've misbalanced our framework in thinking about the trade-offs from a human health perspective.
Yeah, I mean, how much evidence is it going to take for us to act when... Wasn't there a study that came out recently that found that there was something like a teaspoon's worth of plastic in our brains at this point or something like that? I might be misquoting the exact quantity.
You're in the radar, but I think the whole field of microplastics is still fishing for what the right amount is. I mean, we only are measuring, microplastics of certain sizes. There might be certain types of microplastics we're missing in those studies.
Nanoplastics.
Agreed. Nanoplastics, we're barely scratching the surface methodologically. All these studies I talked about of phthalates, of bisphenols, of the PFAS, we've had 50 years of science. We've got this analytical chemistry down. When it comes to microplastics and nanoplastics, we're just scratching the surface, and already we're finding evidence of the effects. And mind you, there's this interesting, going back to Bradford Hill for a moment in terms of strength of evidence, you measure microplastics and you link it to a 4-fold increase in heart attack, stroke, and death. You measure urinary phthalates, which are used in those polyvinyl chloride plastics that were found in the carotid artery, you see a same outcome, cardiovascular mortality. So that's a very compelling, from going back to Bradford Hill, you have 2 different ways of measuring exposure, different populations, US and Italy, and you see the same readout. Now, am I going to tell you that the same effect size is the case in Bangladesh or India or some of the countries where we extrapolated to the effects? No. I mean, we need more research always. But anyone will tell you further research is needed. That's an honest epidemiologist's answer. But that doesn't mean that the stakes are not there and the evidence is not sufficient to act.
It can seem overwhelming, given all of the different, we're talking about plastics, we're talking about phthalates, we're talking about bisphenols. But it seems like there's a universal sort of actionable takeaway, and that is just to reduce your exposure to plastic. I mean, as being the major lever. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah, we need to renegotiate our relationship with plastic. I'm not trying to take us before the era of The Graduate. Sorry for some of the viewers of the channel. You might not know that movie with Dustin Hoffman.
Hoffman, of course, yeah.
Yeah, plastics is the future.
Classic.
Well, it's the past, really. That's the bottom line. And we need to, in particular, use more glass and stainless steel whenever possible. When I fly out tonight to New York, I've got my stainless steel water bottle, and I'm going to hydrate really well, and I'm going to make sure I have a little extra salt to keep me balanced, and I'm going to clear security with it empty and fill it up on the other side. Might not get me to Tokyo, but I can maybe bring 2 stainless steel water bottles.
Are you flying out of LAX?
LAX.
LAX actually sells, you can buy Evian in glass, but it's $9 a bottle.
Oh.
Yeah, it hurts.
I will stick to my old school approach of filling my water bottle after security.
I get it.
Yeah, but taking a step back, I see in various workplaces people distributing those plastic water bottles. And what people don't realize is a lot of those plastic water bottles are, you're buying the plastic, you're not buying the water. The water is actually often tap water from, I don't know, New York City maybe? Not New York City, they don't sell it that way, but certain municipal water supplies provide really good water. And we have forgotten that reality. We almost seem to be afraid of tap water because of some of the phenomena with chemical contamination, like the nonstick chemicals, the forever chemicals. And what we need to do is use tap water supply when we know it's safe to use. Obviously, if you were in Flint, Michigan, when the lead exposure contamination crisis came out, I'm on board with plastic water bottles because low-level lead exposure is extremely catastrophic for that population. PFAS exposure, you need to use filters to get the PFAS out if you have high levels of exposure. But if you've got a good water supply and it's been properly vetted the way the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act is, you will drink from the tap. And that's okay.
I learned this recently, that most flavored beverages, excluding carbonated beverages, but even a sugar-free, like a vitamin water or what have you, they're hot filled into these plastic bottles, which is actually shocking. It's a form. I mean, I guess it makes sense from a food safety standpoint. It's like a form of pasteurization, but that these beverages are hot filled into the bottles, and that the reason they don't do this to water is because the flavored beverages mask the plastic flavor that would otherwise leach into the water. So you're drinking that whenever you drink like a vitamin water or even one of these Whole Foods. You can go to Whole Foods and buy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like a similar.
And you think you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And the fact is that we have a bias towards thinking about microbial contaminants. That's a byproduct of our learning and training. Look, I mean, let's be clear. The Endocrine Society came out with its first scientific statement about chemicals that hack our hormones, especially those used in plastic, in 2009. I was already 15 years out of medical school at that point. I mean, I was learning it on the fly, and only with time have we become more and more aware. You know, the World Health Organization's first statement was 2012. American Academy of Pediatrics was 2018. So our knowledge has evolved to a place where we realize that the old way of acting is not the right way to act now.
Do you think it's possible, the way that they found microplastics in atheromas, that that they might be contributing in other ways to small vessel disease in the brain?
Quite possibly. We have a hard time getting tissue to do those studies properly because you're not going to do brain biopsies on people.
Right.
So Matt Campen at University of New Mexico, who did those studies documenting, I forget the exact amount on the fly, tablespoon or some amount that was shocking, and an increase in the trend line for microplastics detected in these brains. That was in people who had passed away already. So you had the ability to access those kinds of tissues. If you've just given birth and you donate your placenta to research, we can access that. Maybe if you're willing to get a little skin biopsy or a fat biopsy to grab, a little bit of tissue that way, that's fine. But when it comes to microplastics and nanoplastics, that's what you need. That's where the state of the art is. We have to, in general, avoid those uses because ethically I can't suggest a research design where you're going to cause pain or what have you. So you're going to rely on blood and urine, and so then we're back to looking at the chemicals used in plastic materials.
As a pediatrician, do these chemicals worry you from the standpoint of fertility?
Absolutely. And we know that phthalates, for example, during pregnancy, disrupt sex hormone balance, particularly in boys. And there's an anatomical distance called anogenital distance that, except for mini puberty and infancy, there's a little sex hormone pulse after you're born. But what you get at birth is what you have in adulthood. And so what they found is that adult anogenital distance is directly associated with infertility in adult men. And then if you backtrack obviously it's hard to design a 50-year study or 60-year study. We're looking at adults in their anogenital distance and go back to when they were pregnant, when they were in utero, and look at pregnancy exposure to these chemicals. But you look at infants recently born, and you find that pregnancy exposure to phthalates that antagonize the male sex hormone testosterone are associated with shorter anogenital distance in boys. And that shorter anogenital distance correlates with what the adult will eventually have. So kids are being programmed, chiefly boys. We have to do more work in girls because there may be other effects as well in girls because there's a whole bunch of different diseases there that are related to anogenital distance, like endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome. But we know, at least in boys, with the strongest evidence that these phthalates contribute in a way that's not good for later life.
Well, some people listening might be thinking, well, so what? So I'll have a shorter taint. What is the implication there?
Well, the implication there is sperm count's lower, and if you choose to try to conceive, that might lead to a reduced likelihood of conceiving or needing in vitro fertilization.
But is that also a sign that boys are in a way being feminized?
Well, I mean, I think we're going down to a place where we need to do a lot more science before we start to say. What I can say is they're being less viralized in the normal developmental pathway that we understand human biology to go. I can't say more than that. We've got a lot more work to do. We do know that there are many other effects of phthalate exposure that are on the table. We know that phthalates also shrink babies' brain size. We haven't even talked about that. That's because thyroid hormone is this crucial growth factor for brain development in babies. And the baby doesn't make thyroid hormone until the second trimester. So the baby's relying on mom's thyroid hormone. And even in the clinically normal range, this is the frightening part, little changes in thyroid hormone during pregnancy are associated with cognitive deficits, autism, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We've done my colleague, Ahkar Ghasabian, did a study, a large Dutch cohort, in which she saw that IQ points were lower in adults teenagers highly exposed to phthalate exposure in utero. And then they looked at the magnetic resonance images, these brain images, and they found that the total volume of the brain was lower, suggesting a pathway. Then we've been able to go back and look at thyroid hormone in relationship to phthalates, and guess what? Phthalates reduce thyroid hormone function during pregnancy. So we've almost been able to connect all the dots. So again, this speaks to the way this field is so rapidly evolving. I can take you in certain directions where I know certain organs are being affected. I can't take you the whole way, but I can tell you across the totality of the scientific evidence, there are multifocal impacts that should shock all of us.
Wow. So phthalate exposure in utero could be shrinking our brains.
Yes.
Wow. And is fluoride not also known to disrupt thyroid function?
Yes. And we have still some evidence gaps, but there's cause for concern about fluoride and brain development. The Canadian study is probably the closest to U.S. levels of exposure in prevalence. I work closely with a large U.S. consortium called the Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes Program, or ECHO. We're really well poised to study this in a larger scale U.S. population. And insofar as states start to get fluoride out of water, there is actually, I don't mean to suggest that we're using natural experiments on people as a way to figure things out, but that will give us the best data possible to show how levels of fluoride in the context of all of these toxic chemicals to brain development. We haven't even talked about pesticides in brain development. We talked about that last time. We're talking really mostly about plastics, but there are many different contaminants in the environment that need to be addressed, from plastics to pesticides to metals. And that's why, I've actually been heartened to see this is one of the areas where people get surprised when I say that Secretary Kennedy is doing some good things when it comes to human health. He's stated quite publicly, a couple of weeks ago, I was on a roundtable with him, and we talked about the need to address plastic in food contact materials, and particularly chemical additives to plastic like phthalates and the monomers like bisphenols, PFAS, and such.
I think I saw that you were a part of something related to that, and I was very happy to see you on that panel. But you get continually gaslit today about concerns with regards to fluoride. People will say, well, the recommended level of 0.7 milligrams per liter is safe. And I'm just like, well, first of all, you're partaking in a medical experiment that you're not opting into. But also levels vary. And, and if they didn't, we wouldn't have these kinds of epidemiologic studies.
So let's take a step back here and fundamentally think about why we add fluoride to people's bodies. What we're trying to do is get fluoride into teeth. We're trying to prevent cavities. There is now the technology, dentists can do fluoride treatments to everybody growing up in a way that gets fluoride where it needs to get. That's really where we need to focus our energies at this point. So that's what's lost in this debate. We need better dental care in general. And I think some people are afraid of pulling fluoride out of water because there may be certain populations that don't access fluoride treatment in that way. And,
that can't afford adequate dental care.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And trust you me, I have treated more than I'd like to admit a large number of kids over my training who have had cavities and abscesses. And they come to the emergency department, they've got this pain, you think they've got an ear infection, and you're like, ooh, that tooth is tender. And so I empathize with that perspective. But the delivery system that is most efficient is the application directly to teeth.
Yeah. And you can buy toothpaste with fluoride at 7-Eleven at the gas station. Like, it's not something that, fluoride is fairly easy to access if
right.
That's what you want.
And that's really the message here, is that we need to take a step back and rethink something that we did with good intentions. Look, 70, 80 years ago, we needed a way to get fluoride into kids' teeth, and we didn't have the technology in play where we could directly apply it so easily.
Yeah.
And I think this is where the messaging has gotten very noisy and skewed.
Yeah. Get it out of the water. I mean, better safe than sorry is my perspective. Did you catch wind of that recent Center for Environmental Health lawsuit waged against major retailers in the United States when they found that levels of bisphenol S were found to be extremely high on receipts, on thermal paper receipts? Did that cross your radar at all?
Oh, it did. And I'm not surprised. The problem here is that we've operated in a framework where chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. And so researchers like me go study populations. We start to call out problems. And instead of bisphenol A, which I was calling attention to back in 2008, it's making me old at this point talking about it that way, then the FDA got it out of baby bottles and sippy cups. But we've whacked them all. And we've replaced bisphenol A with bisphenol S, F, AP. The list is crazy. It's 140 bisphenols is last count.
Wow.
that I've identified. And what we know about BPS is it is as toxic to embryos and as persistent in the environment. And we know already that bisphenol S messes with bone function, because just like BPA changes how stem cells get navigated in terms of going to bone as opposed to fat, bisphenol S does that same thing. So in a large, again, this Dutch study I talked about, we found bisphenol S in urine in pregnant women was related to lower bone density in 10-year-olds. And mind you, osteoporosis is going up in the United States. And what you have in terms of bone density as a young adult is basically the peak, and you just wither away towards the point where you have bone fractures and other things. So we have a problem here when it comes to chemical whack-a-mole.
So what do you say to people who will claim that alerting consumers to the dangers of routinely handling thermal receipt paper is just alarmist?
Last I checked, people can get email. I mean, again, there's a little bit of just old school common sense here. I try not to be rude when people hand me thermal paper receipts. I mean, I know all too well what I'm talking about. I'm awkwardly, grabbing and putting it away or saying, "Can you email it to me instead?"
But I posted about this recently on my social media, and I was shocked at the number of people who were just like, "This is fear mongering. People have bigger, fish to fry," and I was like, no, dude, like this is something that it's like, first of all, it's an easy lifestyle modification.
Yeah.
It's safe to avoid receipts. We're not talking about like not putting on your seatbelt. And, but I was just like shocked at the level of like pushback, which of course, I shrug off. It's like, to me, it's like, it's so stupid to want to bury your head in the sand when presented with such kind of, I think, useful information. But yeah, it's just it's crazy to me.
We've got an awareness problem still. It's like 1% to 2% know about these issues. And, in my average pediatric academic meeting I go to or some other general medical conference, there still are people who are a little skeptical. I mean, the Endocrine Society has been at the forefront of this for a long time. They're the most aware organization I can think of. And even when I go to that meeting, there's some people who are still a little skeptical, like, do I really believe all this? And that's really where we go back to the need to get this more into the medical curriculum. So much, or just the healthcare provider curriculum. I'm not trying to be biased towards doctors. The point here is we have to focus as much on prevention, or much more on prevention than historically we have. I was taught to write prescriptions for things. And, in the context of the ever-shrinking healthcare provider visit, it gets harder to take time and counsel people on preventative maintenance and safe and simple steps to reduce exposure. We need to actually double down in that direction. And the benefits are we will have less chronic disease to treat in the first place. I mean, it's no secret that we have a huge chronic disease problem in this country, and we have decreasing life expectancy to boot. And that's because of chronic disease. We're great at treating chronic disease in America, but that's not really going to be a sustainable option.
Yeah. So reduce your exposure to plastic and plasticizing compounds. Certainly don't reheat food in plastic, or oil and waterproof wrappings, right? Like the fast food, like burger sandwich wrappers and things like that. Avoid touching thermal receipt paper to the best of your ability.
Yep.
Stop using fragranced products.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other big rocks?
Let's talk about rocks that turn into dust, or plastic dust, or chemical dust. So what we know is that, many products that we use in our daily lives emit, or microplastics break off in invisible ways, and chemicals drop onto the floor or what have you. And what we know is that we inhale or ingest, the hand-to-mouth habit is just something, it's not a baby thing only. I mean, I talk about it a lot as a pediatrician, but it's something we all do. It's just the normal behavior. And that's going to essentially facilitate a recirculation into our intestinal tract. We also inhale this dust. As much as people got focused on ventilation, indoor ventilation in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, there is another subtext that I think is really important and positive. And that is that when you use those Corsi Rosenthal boxes that people were starting to bandy about as a way to increase ventilation in households and prevent viral transmission, what they found is that levels of chemicals and dust, especially the PFAS, dropped. And that's a good thing in terms of chronic disease risk. So we have to think about things like healthy building materials. We need to think about the products we use in materials that emit gases or dusts and ultimately get into our lives. And we need to sometimes use a HEPA filter, a mop, open the window, or recirculate the air more to more readily facilitate the egress of these chemicals, at least into the outdoor air. I mean, it's shoving the problem somewhere else, but it's a better thing than inhaling it or ingesting it.
Yeah, well, the EPA has said that indoor air can be 100 times more polluted than outdoor air.
Unfortunately, that's the reality, and that's because we use many more products that basically are plastic or have other chemical components of concern.
What do you think it's going to take to drive the cost of furniture and other household goods down that don't utilize these kinds of toxic additives? Because I know that, there's like Green Guard for furniture and stuff like that. And it's like wonderful. I mean, I'm grateful that I can afford this stuff. Thank God.
Right.
But like not everybody can.
Agreed.
So, we don't want this to be like an elitist privilege, afforded to the few.
It doesn't really have to be, first of all. I mean, I already talked about reducing phthalate exposure that was successful in low-income as well as high-income families. And the same has been found to be true for pesticide exposure, by the way. I know we're talking about plastics, but I use that as an example to say, you can reduce these exposures, and it doesn't have to strictly be a bougie thing to think about. If we invoke the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, he would be an environmentalist. He would be screaming mad about plastics in our environment. Now, he's died a few hundred years ago, but suffice it to say, he would be mad because these chemicals cause externalities. They cause us social and economic costs that aren't incorporated in the products that we buy or sell. So we overproduce chemicals at a cheaper cost than the societally optimal amount. And prices for the safer products don't match where the benefits really are. So there's a mispricing in the market. This is just classic market dysfunction. Ideally, what would happen is that the people who are making these toxic products would incorporate that in their price of working, such that they would produce at a higher cost, and produce less. I'm not saying we're zeroing out toxic chemical exposure, just to be clear. Adam Smith wouldn't go there. But suffice it to say that we have the market's not working the way it should. And and the good news is, despite the fact the market's not working the way it should, there are companies that are stepping up their game. I've run 26 marathons. I actually, when I was last on the show, I think it was at about 9. So I've been stepping up my game lately. But running is a great source of plastic exposures, because all the things that we put next to our bodies, we're used to using poly as our wear of choice for things. It's just easy to get and what have you. It contributes to a lot of these exposures as well. And it's not good either for our planet. I can't give you direct human health consequences from the use of plastics in that kind of gear. But suffice it to say that it's cheap and it's accessible. And that is not really what we should be doing. But to the point of companies stepping up their game, the more I look on the socials in particular, people are demanding natural materials. And I'm not saying natural is completely safe either. Natural does not mean safe, by the way. So we need to assess natural and synthetic materials by the same evidence standard. If a natural material is toxic, we shouldn't use it. But those natural materials are starting to come on the consciousness, and consumers are willing to pay the premium for those kinds of materials. Just like they're paying more for a little more for organic food. And what happens there, this is again going back to the socioeconomics here, because people say, well, Dr. Trasande, you're saying that people should pay more for organic food. These poor folks in food deserts, they can't afford it. You're hurting them by saying that. But what happens is you change the market forces as the market share goes up for these products. And then what happens is you have this perfect circle of innovation that manifests in a cheaper version of the product being generated. We can use sustainable and green chemistry for good in a way that has less toxic products that are less costly to society. And that can be in our food, that can be in our clothing, that can be in a host of products in our daily lives. We just have to reinvent in a way that we always have in society. That's how we got ourselves here in the first place, by the way. We realized that plastic was not just useful for military equipment. We got there because plastic was useful for that, and then we realized, ooh, it's actually pretty cool to use in all of these other materials like furniture. And then we used plastic in every conceivable thing because it was cheap. We need to just this is a disruptive innovation event. This is an opportunity for positive economic development. And that's where the companies and the countries that are leading the way are going to be the winners here.
Amen. Yeah, because it doesn't make sense why you would pay more for a product with fewer chemical inputs, right?
Right.
But it's economies of scale, is what you're saying. It's like these chemical manufacturers, they overproduce these chemicals, and so it just makes it dirt cheap.
Right.
And but by voting with your dollars for the kinds of products that you do want to see succeed in the marketplace, you're actually allowing them to produce those goods at scale at a cheaper cost.
And when I think about the global plastics treaty negotiation process that's going on right now, the United Nations is actually really deeply engaged in discussions about the broader plastic pollution threat. It started with ocean plastics. That's what got people excited and upset. But they realized, wow, it's not just what we see in the oceans, that Pacific garbage patch. We actually have a Pacific garbage patch in each of our bodies. It's just invisible. And we now realize that we have to think about human health as part of that equation. As part of that negotiation process, you're seeing companies actually that used to be plastic producers come to the table and say, hey, we actually need some rules here. We're giving you our hands. We're not asking you to handcuff us, but we're asking you to guide us in a way so that we have some regulatory certainty. Now, that doesn't take them completely off the hook. They need to have chemical safety as their first priority. But that, to me, is an opportunity for driving innovation in a positive way. And that's where chemicals of concern are at the top of the priority list. If we have common rules so that every country in the globe operates by the same rule book, we in the US won't get imported plastics that are toxic to our health. We can regulate plastics in the United States, but we're still getting plastics from all across the world that may be as problematic. So we have skin in that game here in the United States as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly optimistic. I'm super grateful to you for pushing the envelope forward in terms of the research and advocacy. And, I'm going to continue to do my part. So thanks for coming out. Where can listeners, I know you have a book out. How can listeners just pick up your book, learn more, connect with you, and support your research?
So Sicker, Fatter, Poorer is the book. It's still hanging out on Amazon. It's still pretty much modern in the context of 5 years old. I mean, it's not doing bad. It's aging kind of in cat years. And but my socials are Leo Trasande, Trasande, and I've got a leotrasande.com website, among other things, and people can contact me there.
Love it. Well, thanks for coming out, brother.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah,
always.
Super, super enlightening. Thank you guys for listening. Love you very much. Share this episode around, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Peace. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.